Afternoon, everybody. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about a man whose name was Thomas Jonathan Jackson. Now, we're not going to be discussing much of what he did in terms of the war and how he was single-handedly responsible for the destruction of the careers of many Union officers. And you always hear the things about how he was obsessed with lemons and a lot of things like that. But today we're going to go in a little bit more depth on exactly who he was. He was a gentleman from Lexington, Virginia, and he was part of the West Point class of 1846. And like many of his classmates in that class, George McClellan, George Pickett, and so many others, he actually went to the Mexican War like so many of his classmates did. And after the war, he actually got involved and taught at what was known as the Virginia Military Institute in Lexington, Virginia. And there he taught for several years. Now, a little more on that. Now, we all have those classes where you just learn really quick it's better to not ask questions. And this was not because he was cruel or mean or disciplinarian or anything. Just whenever someone asked a question when Jackson was teaching, his response would be to reteach the entire lesson the next day. And so it became very quick. You know, you have a question, you talk to your peers later on, or you figure out something, you go buy another book, but you don't ask questions during the class. That's one thing there. And after that, he was appointed to be a Confederate officer as soon as the war broke out, because he was not actually in the U.S. Army anymore. He'd served his time in the Army, and he was actually an instructor. And so what happened was, in the first battle of Bull Run, where the lines were breaking, because it was the first battle, no one really knew how to fight. It was noticed by General Bernard B. that Jackson with his troops were standing firm. And he tried to rally up his men and try to get his men pumped. He said, look at Jackson over there standing like a stone wall. And that, my friends, is how he got the name Stonewall Jackson. After time, he was eventually promoted to Major General. And an interesting thing happened in 1862, early 1862, where he actually came into conflict with the Confederate government. There was another officer that was under his command, and quite frankly, he had a very different way of leading troops than Jackson did. And Jackson butted heads with him. This gentleman wound up actually losing a very easily defendable position, and he was saying how mean Jackson was, how horrible he was, how the men were hungry, the men were tired, the men were being overworked, and basically which was soldier's life. And he thought his men deserved to be treated better. And he broke the chain of command, did not go to Jackson, went around him to the Confederate Congress. And Confederate Secretary of War Judah P. Benjamin went over that situation, and he decided to make the call to remove and give the other general what he wanted. Jackson said, I'm not going to quote it verbatim, but he basically said, okay, you're not going to give me what I need to run this situation. I make a request that you simply remove me from command and let me go back to my old job as superintendent of VMI. Or if that can't happen, then I will offer my resignation immediately to the president. Needless to say, they wound up moving that other general, and the Confederate Congress did not meddle in Jackson's affairs ever again. Now, you always hear how, as I said earlier, that they say Jackson was obsessed with lemons, and he was always sucking on a lemon. That was actually a myth. Jackson was a hypochondriac. He had such beliefs of health where he would not even let his back lean. He would not lean back against a chair. He would not let his back touch a chair, because he thought if he leaned back or slouched down, that it would quote-unquote crush his inside. So he would not even do that. And in battle, he would actually raise one fist. It would actually help flow the circulation. And because of him being a hypochondriac, he had himself on a strict dietary regimen of fresh fruits and vegetables. He was always eating that. Actually, his favorite, well, he would eat lemons. His favorite actually were peaches. Because what happened there was at the Battle of Antietam, which is known and remembered by most all veterans of the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia as the fiercest battle of all the battles in the war. One of the Confederate officers saw Jackson sitting on his horse, calmly eating a peach, his favorite fruit. Another thing that they brought out was like, why was he always so calm? He talked to one of his officers and he said, I'm not quoting him verbatim, but he said, God knows when it's time for me to be done. He has appointed the time for me to go. And it's for when it's time for me to go, I will be ready. because he was a very strong religious man, more along the lines of a Calvinist, where he believed that what the Bible says is cut and dry. You don't question it, you don't interpret it. Now, and from there, another thing was he was a doting father. After the Battle of Fredericksburg in 1862, the army was in winter camp, and his wife had just had their little girl, and they came in to see him because there was nothing going on. It was winter camp, and one of the officers commented how Jackson was his eyes were fixated on his little girl, and he was just focused on her, and he just ate her up with a spoon. And one thing is that he had a very unique way of parenting. And I guess it's very common for how things were, particularly in the 19th century, when the baby would fuss, he would gently lie her down in her crib and just watch patiently for her to self-soothe. And when she stopped crying, then he'd pick her up again. That's just the way he did it. Very, very strict and very calm that way. And finally, after a while, when the baby got the hint, his daughter Julie got the hint that, okay, if I stop crying, Daddy will hold me again, that's when she stopped crying, he'd pick her up. Now, another question that has come up about Stonewall Jackson, as with most Confederates, is what were his positions on slavery? He didn't speak on it much. He was not a slave owner, but he did something that actually showed by his actions where he really stood on the issue. In 1855, he actually broke Virginia state law, which is against teaching the slaves, or teaching anyone of quote-unquote color about reading and writing or anything of that matter, and he taught Sunday school to slaves and all around the area of Lexington. They would come to him and he would teach them. He taught them the gospel. He taught them the gospels. He taught them about Jesus, and he treated them like people. And it got to where, and this part actually choked me up when I read it, when he said there were actually some of the slaves who would plead with him for him to purchase them so that they would not be sold into the Deep South and be worked to death. And it happened in 1906. There was a gentleman by the name of Downing, and his parents actually were both taught by Jackson. So he took a collection, and they actually got a memorial to Jackson put in the 5th Avenue Presbyterian Church in Roanoke, Virginia. So it could be said that Stonewall Jackson is the only Confederate general who has a memorial to him in an Afro-American church. So there you go.